The weathered cabin door groaned on rusted hinges as Dasan pushed it open, his keen eyes scanning the dim interior with the practiced caution of a hunter who had learned that survival depended on seeing danger before it saw him. The young Apache warrior moved with fluid grace, his worn moccasins silent against the rough-hewn threshold. Dust motes danced in the shaft of amber sunlight that sliced through the gloom, and his calloused hand rested with deceptive casualness on the stock of his Winchester rifle. This place should have been empty. The tracks in the hardpan outside told of weeks without human presence. Yet something stirred in the shadows beyond the crude plank partition, a pale shape pressed against the far wall, like a wounded animal seeking refuge from predators. Dasan's muscles coiled with tension, the rifle rising smoothly toward his shoulder. Then the shape moved into the light, and he saw her clearly, a woman, crouched in the corner, her once blue calico dress torn at the shoulder and stained dark across the bodice, with what looked like dried blood. Around her slender throat, the scattered remnants of a broken necklace caught the dying light bone, and silver beads strewn across her collarbone like fallen stars. Her hands trembled against the rough floorboards, dirt ground deep beneath her fingernails. And when she attempted to rise, her knees buckled with exhaustion. But it was her eyes that held him green, as spring water after rain, wide with terror, yet somehow defiant, refusing to surrender to the fear that coursed through her frame like poison. "Please," she whispered the word barely audible above the desert wind that rattled the loose chinking between the logs. "I mean you no harm." Dasan studied her face, recognition flickering through his memory like heat lightning across a summer sky. This was the widow woman who had arrived in Cinder Bluff with her homesteader husband during the spring planting season. The same woman whose man had died 2 weeks past in what Sheriff Malloy proclaimed a mining accident, though whispers in the Apache camps suggested otherwise. The distant sound of iron-shod hooves striking hardpan carried through the desert air, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the unmistakable whistle that Deputy Rattler used to announce his approach to those unfortunate enough to be on his list. The woman flinched at the sound, pressing deeper into her corner, and that reaction told Dasan everything he needed to know about who pursued her and why. "I am Dasan of the Chiricahua," he said, lowering the Winchester, but keeping it ready. "I seek only shelter for the night." Her green eyes flicked to the door, then back to his weathered face. She was young, perhaps 24 summers, with auburn hair that had escaped its pins to frame features marked by recent hardship, and something deeper, a core of steel that had been forged in fires he could only imagine. "They murdered my husband," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Now they come for what little remains." The hoofbeats grew louder, joined by rough voices and the creak of leather saddles strained by the weight of armed men. Through a gap in the shutters, Dasan counted 3 riders approaching, led by the thick-set deputy, whose scarred face had earned him his serpentine nickname. These were not men who came calling with charitable intentions. "Can you travel hard and fast?" Dasan asked, making his decision with the swift certainty that had kept him alive through 27 summers of frontier warfare. She pushed herself upright, testing her weight on trembling legs. Pain flashed across her features, but she managed to stand with visible effort. "I'll have to, won't I?" His grandfather had taught him that some burdens chose their bearers rather than the reverse, and this pale woman with her defiant spirit carried the weight of injustice that demanded answer. More than that, something in her reminded him of another woman, his sister Aponi, whose laughter had been silenced by the same kind of men who now rode toward this isolated cabin with violence in their hearts. "Then we leave. Now." Cinder Bluff sprawled across the high desert like a wound that refused to heal, sustained by the uncertain mercy of Willow Creek and the failing silver veins of Raven Rock Mine. The settlement claimed perhaps 200 souls on its better days, though that number fluctuated with the comings and goings of prospectors, drifters, and men running from their pasts toward uncertain futures. Sheriff Victor Malloy ruled this domain with a smile that never reached his pale eyes, and a badge that had become more license than law. At 43, he possessed the lean build of a man who preferred manipulation to physical confrontation, though the ivory-handled Colt at his hip suggested he could handle both when circumstances demanded. His voice carried the cultured tones of an educated man, which made his corruption all the more insidious. Power, gentlemen, he was fond of telling his deputies, is not about the gun on your hip. It's about knowing when to use it and when to merely suggest its presence. Fear is a more reliable tool than force, and both are more profitable than justice. His deputies shared his philosophy, though they lacked his sophistication. Men like Rattler understood only the crude mathematics of violence. Apply enough pressure, and any problem would eventually yield to solution. They wore their badges like shields against consequence, believing the legal authority absolved them of moral responsibility. The water that sustained life in this harsh territory flowed at the discretion of Copper Jim Morrison, a bull of a man who had claimed upstream rights through a combination of forged documents and brutal intimidation. His Double C ranch sprawled across the choicest grazing land for 50 miles in any direction, and his riders carried themselves with the arrogance of men who knew their boss owned more than cattle and horses. When Copper Jim spoke, his voice rumbled like distant thunder carrying the implicit threat of storms to come. This territory's got two kinds of people, he would say, fixing visitors with eyes like chips of flint. Them that bend the knee to power, and them that get buried under it. Ain't no middle ground, and ain't no mercy for fools who think otherwise. The woman hiding in the cabin was Evangeline Morrison, widow of Thomas, though few in Cinder Bluff knew her story beyond the basic facts that traveled with gossip and speculation. She had arrived in April with her earnest husband, who had filed homestead papers on the quarter section that included the cabin and its life-giving spring. Thomas had borrowed against the land for seed money and farming implements, standard practice, that turned lethal when mine-blasting powder exploded, prematurely catching him in the tunnel before he could escape to safety. Sheriff Malloy had ruled the death accidental within hours of body recovery, but certain details troubled those who bothered to look closely. Dr. Edmund Hale, the territory's only trained physician, had noted burn patterns inconsistent with standard blasting procedures. The fuse length seemed wrong, and the placement of charges suspicious, but his concerns fell on deaf ears when money and influence weighed against mere evidence and medical opinion. What Dasan couldn't know, crouched in that cabin with a terrified woman, was that Dr. Hale carried a burden of guilt that ate at him like acid. 3 days before Thomas Morrison's death, Copper Jim had visited the doctor's clinic with an unusual request information about a homesteader's medical condition allegedly for insurance purposes. When Hale refused, citing patient confidentiality, 2 of Jim's men had appeared at his home that evening. "Doc," the lead gunman had said conversationally, watching Hale's 6-year-old daughter play in the garden, "my boss is a reasonable man. He don't like to threaten folks, but sometimes business is business. Now you got a choice, provide them medical records he needs, or we'll be back to discuss your family's health in more personal terms." The next morning, Hale had provided falsified medical records, stating that Thomas Morrison suffered from a weak heart and dizzy spells, conditions that would make working near dangerous explosives inadvisable. When the accident occurred, those same records provided convenient explanation for why an experienced man might have made a fatal error in judgment. Hale had signed the death certificate with hands that shook, knowing he had helped murder an innocent man, but unable to see any alternative that wouldn't endanger his wife and children. 3 days after Thomas's burial, Copper Jim had appeared at the cabin, with papers showing the homestead debt had been transferred to his holdings through a complex web of territorial regulations and convenient legal interpretations. When Evangeline refused to vacate, Deputy Rattler had provided a demonstration of frontier justice that left her bruised and broken, but not quite beaten. She had been hiding since then, living on spring water and the last of her husband's provisions, waiting for courage or desperation to show her a path forward. The sound of approaching horses shattered the desert quiet like breaking glass. Spurs jingled against stirrups, and Rattler's voice carried through the thin walls with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his demands met promptly. "Come on out, widow lady. Sheriff's got some questions about them outstanding debts, and we ain't got all day to jaw about it." The door latch rattled ominously. Dasan moved like flowing water, crossing to where Evangeline crouched and pressing one finger to his lips for absolute silence. She nodded understanding, and he guided her behind the door frame where shadows offered concealment. When he placed her trembling hand on his gun belt to steady her balance, the contact sent unexpected warmth through both of them. Their first physical touch, born of necessity but carrying undercurrents, neither had time to examine. The door exploded inward with a crash of splintered wood. Rattler filled the entrance, his massive frame blocking most of the afternoon light, one scarred hand resting on his holstered weapon, while his small, mean eyes swept the interior like a snake searching for prey. "I know you're hiding in here, missy," he growled, stepping carefully into the cabin's main room. "Sheriff don't like to be kept waiting, and neither do I. Come out peaceable and we'll make this quick and clean." Dasan struck without warning or mercy. His left hand clamped around Rattler's gun wrist, twisting with leverage learned from boyhood wrestling matches that had prepared him for deadlier contests. The deputy's grunt of pain cut short as Dasan's shoulder drove into his midsection, propelling both men backward into the cabin's rough-hewn table. Furniture collapsed under their combined weight with a crash that brought shouts from the waiting riders outside. Rattler clawed for his Colt with his free hand, but Dasan reversed his grip on the Winchester, swinging the stock in a precise arc that connected with the deputy's temple. Rattler's eyes rolled back, and he slumped unconscious among the broken table legs, blood trickling from his scalp to stain the floorboards. Moving with fluid efficiency born of long practice, Dasan hauled the dead weight toward the door, where two more riders sat their horses with weapons drawn but uncertain. The unconscious deputy made an effective human shield, and his companions hesitated to risk hitting their partner with poorly aimed shots. "This woman is under my protection," Dasan announced, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a war chief addressing enemy warriors. "Tell your sheriff that any who trouble her will answer to me personally. And tell him that the son of Iron Wolf Walking does not make idle threats." He shoved Rattler toward his mount with enough force to wake the semi-conscious man. The deputy, bleeding from his head wound and swaying in his saddle, managed to stay upright with help from his companions. When he spat, the saliva was pink with blood and hatred. "You just signed your death warrant, Apache." Rattler slurred through swollen lips, his words carrying the venom of a man who had never been bested in single combat. "Ain't nowhere in this godforsaken territory you can hide from what's coming for you. My grandfather used to say," Dasan replied with the calm certainty of a man who had faced death before and emerged victorious, "that the rattlesnake only strikes when cornered, but some men need no reason at all. Perhaps you should consider which one you wish to be." The riders wheeled their horses and galloped toward town dust devils, marking their retreat like smoke signals announcing the beginning of war. Dasan watched until they disappeared around a bend in the creek bed, and then turned to find Evangeline standing in the doorway, no longer cowering but upright, with squared shoulders. "They'll return with more men," she said, stating fact rather than asking questions, her voice carrying a new steadiness that impressed him. "Within the hour," Dasan agreed, noting how quickly she had gathered her few possessions into a canvas pack and donned her late husband's brown wool coat. The transformation from victim to survivor was happening before his eyes. "Are you prepared to leave everything behind?" "There's nothing left here worth keeping," she replied. But her fingers touched the broken necklace at her throat, the one piece of her former life she couldn't abandon. "This isn't your fight, you know. You could simply ride away." Dasan considered this, weighing wisdom against something deeper, a recognition he saw reflected in her emerald eyes. Both of them carried wounds inflicted by men who believed power made them untouchable. Both had learned that justice was something you fought for, rather than waited to receive from corrupt officials. But more than that, she reminded him of a pony. Not in appearance, his sister had been dark where this woman was fair, but in the set of her jaw, the refusal to yield, even when beaten down, the spark of defiance that no amount of brutality could extinguish. A pony who had vanished 3 months ago after confronting Copper Jim's men about their treatment of Apache children. A pony whose laughter he would never hear again, but whose spirit demanded that he stand against the same evil that had silenced her forever. "My sister once told me that some battles choose their warriors," he said finally, shouldering his rifle and checking his ammunition supply. "I believe this is such a battle." Their eyes met and held for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, two damaged souls recognizing kinship in shared loss and mutual determination. Then she nodded, once adjusted her pack, and followed him into the gathering dusk, where their real journey would begin. They moved northeast through terrain that seemed designed by nature to frustrate pursuit arroyos carved by flash floods, boulder fields that would challenge even experienced trackers, and stretches of hardpan that showed tracks poorly in the failing light. Evangeline proved herself an apt student of wilderness travel, adapting quickly to Dasan's teachings about silent movement and natural concealment. "Step heel first on stone," he instructed during one brief rest, demonstrating the technique that had kept Apache warriors invisible for countless generations. "Let your weight settle gradually. Speed means nothing if it alerts your enemies to your presence." She practiced the movement until it became natural, her initial awkwardness giving way to growing confidence. When he showed her how to read the land ahead for obstacles and opportunities, she absorbed the lessons with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge meant the difference between life and death. "Tell me about your husband," Dasan said as they picked their way along a game trail that wound between towering saguaro cacti. The moon was rising, casting silver light across the desert landscape and turning familiar terrain into something mysterious and otherworldly. Evangeline was quiet for so long, he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of love and regret that he recognized from his own memories of the dead. Thomas was a good man. Gentle, educated, believed in working within the system to achieve justice. She paused to adjust her pack, wincing slightly as the straps rubbed against her shoulders. "He would have been horrified to see me running through the desert with an Apache warrior carrying his rifle and learning to fight." "What did he dream of?" Dasan asked, sensing there was more to the story than simple tragedy. Her face softened in the moonlight, and for a moment he glimpsed the woman she had been before violence changed her forever. "A garden," she said quietly. He talked endlessly about the garden we would plant beside the cabin. Tomatoes and beans, corn and squash he'd read about companion planting in some agricultural journal. And children. He wanted at least 3 children to help work the land and carry on when we were gone. The pain in her voice was raw and immediate, the kind of anguish that comes from dreams destroyed rather than simply deferred. Dasan understood that pain intimately. He had felt it himself when a pony disappeared, taking with her all the plans they had made for their people's future. "Yet, here you are," he said gently. "Yes," she replied. And now her voice carried steel beneath the sorrow. "Because Thomas's way got him murdered by men who respect nothing but force." His faith in law and fairness made him a target, not a citizen. There was something in her tone that spoke of fundamental change, of a woman discovering strength she never knew she possessed, while mourning the innocence that discovery had cost her. Dasan found himself respecting this pale creature, who had learned that survival sometimes required abandoning civilization's pretty lies about order and justice. They reached the rim of Catclaw Canyon as false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Below them, the narrow gorge wound between red sandstone walls carved by millennia of flash floods. It offered both sanctuary and potential trap defensible positions, but limited escape routes if their pursuers found the entrances. "We can rest here," Dasan said, leading her to a shallow cave that would provide shelter from both weather and prying eyes. But only for a few hours. They settled on the sandy floor, sharing jerky from his pack and water from his canteen. The cave's intimate confines forced them to sit close together, shoulders touching, sharing warmth as the desert night's chill penetrated their travel-stained clothing. In the growing light, he could see exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes, but also a determination that reminded him powerfully of his sister. "Why are you helping me?" Evangeline asked suddenly, her green eyes reflecting the last starlight. "You don't owe me anything. You don't even know my name." Dasan stared out at the stars that were beginning to fade with approaching dawn. For a long moment he wrestled with memories and pain he rarely shared with anyone, especially not with white strangers who might use such knowledge against him. "I had a sister," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "A pony, it means butterfly in our tongue. She was spirited like you." "Tell me about her," Evangeline said, something in her tone, not mere curiosity, but genuine desire to understand, encouraged him to continue. Dasan was quiet for a moment, sorting through memories that were both precious and painful. "She laughed like water over stones," he said finally. "Clear and bright and impossible to ignore. When we were children, she could make our grandmother smile even when the winter had been hard and food was scarce." His voice grew stronger as he spoke, animated by recollections that brought his sister briefly back to life in the desert darkness. But she was clever, too cleverer than any of us realized. When the soldiers came to move our people to the reservation, a pony was the one who suggested hiding the children in the sacred caves while the adults negotiated. 17 children lived because of her quick thinking, including myself. "She sounds remarkable," Evangeline said softly. "She was. She came to your town sometimes to sell beadwork to travelers and traders. The white women liked her jewelry because it was beautiful, but also because she could tell stories while they shopped. She learned your language perfectly, could read and write better than most men." Pride and grief warred in his voice. "She believed that understanding between our peoples was possible, that trade and friendship could replace warfare." "What happened to her?" The question hung in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Dasan's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment Evangeline saw the warrior beneath his careful control. Dangerous grieving and absolutely lethal when aroused to anger. "She vanished 3 months ago. The last anyone saw her, she was confronting some of Copper Jim's men about their treatment of an Apache child they'd been tormenting for sport." His voice remained carefully neutral, but she heard the anguish beneath the surface. "A 10-year-old boy who had come to town with his mother to trade hides. They were making him dance for their amusement, throwing coins at his feet and laughing when he stumbled. And a pony intervened. Of course she did. She could never watch the strong prey upon the weak without taking action." Dasan's voice grew distant, lost in painful memory. "The boy's mother told me that a pony spoke to those men in perfect English, telling them exactly what she thought of their character and their parentage. She wasn't afraid of them, even though she should have been." And you think Copper Jim killed her? I know he did. Just as surely as I know he had your husband murdered for his land and water rights. Dasan turned to look at her, their faces inches apart in the cave's intimate confines. They hurt you because they believed you belonged to them like livestock, to be branded and controlled. That alone is reason enough for my involvement. Evangeline reached out impulsively, covering his clenched fist with her small hand. The gesture was simple, wordless, but it carried more comfort than any speech might have provided. For a moment they sat in shared silence, two people bound together by loss and the dangerous hope that justice might still be possible in an unjust world. Thomas and I, she said finally, we dreamed of having a daughter first. He wanted to name her Hope because he said this country needed more hope and less fear. Her voice caught slightly. I used to imagine her playing in our garden while we worked, laughing the way you described your sister laughing. She would have been beautiful, Dasan said quietly, with your eyes and his gentle spirit. She would have known both worlds. Evangeline continued, and now her voice carried a note of fierce determination. Apache and white, speaking both languages, understanding both peoples. The kind of bridge your sister believed was possible. They held each other's gaze in the growing dawn light, recognizing something profound in that moment of shared vulnerability. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, carrying the dreams of the dead toward an uncertain but increasingly shared future. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Dasan lifted his head to listen with the focused attention of a man whose survival had always depended on reading nature's warnings correctly. Storm approaching, he observed. That could help or hinder us depending on its intensity. By full daylight, towering thunderheads had built on the horizon, promising the first significant rainfall in weeks. The air grew thick and oppressive, charged with electricity that made their skin prickle and their hair stand on end with static. In the settlements below, search parties were organizing their movements, visible from the canyon rim, like ants disturbed from their nest. Dr. Edmund Hale moved through Cinder Bluff's dusty streets with the deliberate pace of a man carrying an enormous burden of guilt. The wanted posters that Malloy's men had plastered around town proclaimed Evangeline Morrison a delinquent debtor, and Dasan a horse thief and suspected murderer. But Hale remembered the bruises he had treated on the widow woman, and more importantly, he remembered his own cowardice in the face of Copper Jim's threats. Each poster he encountered seemed to mock his failure of courage. With trembling hands, he struck a match and watched the lies burn, knowing that destroying paper would not absolve him of complicity in Thomas Morrison's death. But perhaps if he could find the courage he had lacked before he could still help the living find justice for the dead. The doctor's real work began when he sought out Beatrice Cole, the unmarried schoolteacher, whose sharp mind had already cataloged the inconsistencies in official accounts of recent deaths. She received his carefully coded message with grim understanding, recognizing the risk he took in reaching out to potential allies. "We have a problem," Hale told her when they met secretly in the schoolhouse, after hours, his voice heavy with exhaustion and self-reproach. "A bigger problem than just Copper Jim and his hired guns." He showed her the medical records he had been forced to falsify, explaining his role in providing legal cover for murder. His hands shook as he spread the documents across her desk, and his voice cracked when he described the threats that had broken his professional oath. "They came to my home, Beatrice. Stood in my garden and watched my little girl play while they explained what cooperation meant." Tears ran down his weathered cheeks. "I told myself I was protecting my family, but I was really just protecting myself. I couldn't bear the thought of losing them, so I helped murder an innocent man instead." Beatrice listened without judgment, understanding that a man with family to protect might make choices that a single woman could condemn more easily. When he finished his confession, she was quiet for a long moment, studying the falsified documents with the analytical mind that had made her an exceptional teacher. "Edmund," she said finally, her voice gentle but firm, "you made the choice any loving father would make when faced with impossible circumstances. But now you have another choice to make." "I know," he whispered. "That's why I'm here." "There's more." She continued, opening her own collection of carefully hidden documents. "Walter Pike came to me yesterday with information about territorial officials. This corruption goes all the way to the capital, Edmund. Land grants, mining rights, water allocations, it's all connected in a web that reaches much higher than we imagined." They were interrupted by a soft knock at the schoolhouse door. Pike himself stood outside, his weathered face etched with worry and determination in equal measure. At 45, he had spent 20 years fighting the harsh land for every acre he could claim, only to watch it slowly stolen through legal manipulation and intimidation. "They've got federal marshals asking questions in Tucson," he reported, settling his lean frame into one of the student desks with unconscious irony. "They carried warrants bearing the seal of the U.S. District Court." Beatrice slipped into the assay office and tapped a terse wire to Tucson, a coded appeal for federal help, then burned the draft by lamplight. "The word is that Washington has finally noticed too many homesteaders dying in convenient accidents. If we can keep Mrs. Morrison and her Apache friend alive, long enough help might actually arrive." "How long?" Beatrice asked. "Week, maybe 2 if we're lucky. But that's assuming Malloy doesn't get to them first, and assuming the Federals ain't already bought off like everyone else in this godforsaken territory." Pike's voice carried the bitter wisdom of a man who had learned not to trust authority. "We need to do something ourselves, and we need to do it soon." Dr. Hale cleared his throat, his decision finally crystallizing into action. "I have information that could help them. Medical evidence that proves Thomas Morrison was murdered, along with documentation of how the cover-up was arranged." He paused, gathering courage for what came next. "But someone needs to get it to them, and I'm not exactly built for desert travel." "I'll go," Pike said immediately. "I know this country better than most, and my farm's already lost if we don't act." "Walter, you have a wife and children to consider," Beatrice reminded him gently. "All the more reason to stop this now," he replied with quiet firmness. "If we don't make a stand here, there won't be anywhere left to run. Copper Jim and Malloy will own everything from here to California, and our families will be serfs on our own land." The 3 unlikely conspirators looked at each other across the schoolhouse's simple wooden desks, recognizing the moment when good people were forced to choose between safety and conscience. Outside, the wind was rising with the approaching storm, carrying with it the promise of change. Whether for better or worse remained to be seen. "There's something else," Hale said quietly. "Something I haven't told anyone, not even my wife." He pulled a small leather journal from his medical bag, his hands trembling as he opened it. "I've been keeping records. Every suspicious death, every convenient accident, every time I was forced to falsify a medical report. Names, dates, circumstances, everything." Pike whistled low. "How many?" 17 deaths in the past 2 years. All of them property owners, all of them obstacles to someone's plans for expansion." Hale's voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if confession was lifting a tremendous weight from his shoulders. "Thomas Morrison was just the latest. If this pattern continues, none of us will live to see next Christmas." But help seemed impossibly distant as storm clouds gathered overhead, and the sound of tracking dogs carried across the desert wind. In the canyon, Dasan and Evangeline prepared for the next phase of their desperate flight, knowing that each hour brought their enemies closer, while their own options grew increasingly limited. The storm struck with the sudden fury that characterized desert weather, transforming the world into chaos within minutes. Rain fell in sheets that turned dust to treacherous mud and filled the narrow canyon with the roar of rushing water. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks that illuminated the landscape in stark black and white, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Dasan and Evangeline had moved deeper into the canyon, following a precarious ledge that hugged the north wall. The footing became treacherous as rain turned stable stone to slick treachery and loosened rocks that had been secure for centuries. Behind them, shouts echoed through the storm as their pursuers spread out to block all possible escape routes. A rifle cracked the sound almost lost in the thunder's boom. The bullet sparked off the rock face beside Evangeline's head, and she stumbled as her ankle twisted on the wet stone. Only Dasan's quick reflexes prevented her from falling into the growing torrent below his arm, circling her waist as he pulled her to safety on a narrow shelf protected by an overhang. "Let me examine it," he said, kneeling to check her injured ankle, while rain poured off the rock above them like a waterfall. The joint was swelling rapidly, but didn't appear broken. A painful twist that would hamper their movement, but not stop it entirely. He tore strips from his shirt to create a supportive bandage, his hands steady despite the urgency of their situation. "I can still travel," she said through gritted teeth, though he could see the pain etched in lines around her eyes. "I know you can," he replied, securing the bandage with practiced efficiency. "My father always said that true strength shows itself not in avoiding pain, but in moving forward despite it." While he worked on her ankle, Evangeline had been examining the contents of her pack, taking inventory of their meager supplies in case they needed to abandon everything for speed. She unwrapped the broken necklace, carefully studying the scattered beads that had once formed a complete piece of jewelry. "These aren't mine," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the sound of falling rain. Dasan looked up from her ankle, and his breath caught when he saw what lay in her palm. The beads were bone and turquoise worked into traditional patterns, but it was the distinctive sunflower design etched into the largest pieces that made his hands tremble as he reached for them. "Where did you get these?" Thomas was wearing them when he died, hidden under his shirt where no one would see them. She held them closer to the dim light, filtering through the storm. "I thought they were something he had purchased for me, perhaps as a surprise gift." "But this is Apache work, isn't it?" Dasan's voice was barely audible above the thunder. "These belong to a pony. She made them for—" Understanding struck him like a physical blow, and suddenly the scattered pieces of a terrible puzzle began forming a complete picture. For someone she cared about, someone she trusted enough to share our people's sacred symbols. She was selling beadwork to Thomas. Evangeline said, comprehension dawning in her green eyes. He mentioned buying jewelry from an Apache woman, said she was intelligent and kind. He wanted to support her work because he believed in fair trade between our peoples. But that revelation was only the beginning. As Dasan examined the beads more closely, he noticed that several were stained with something dark and viscous that carried a distinctive odor despite being dried. He scraped at the substance with his thumbnail, and it flaked away to reveal the bone beneath a residue that he recognized from his father's teachings about mining and explosives. "Blasting oil?" He said the words carrying terrible significance. "From mine operations." Evangeline was searching through her pack, with new urgency pulling out her husband's few personal effects, with the focused intensity of someone who had suddenly understood that answers lay hidden in plain sight. In a carefully concealed seam sewn into the lining of his coat, she discovered a folded document that made her gasp when she opened it to the storm's intermittent lightning. The paper bore multiple official seals and signatures dated one day before Thomas's death. But it wasn't the simple land transfer document she had expected. It was correspondence between Sheriff Malloy and territorial officials in the capital, outlining a systematic plan to seize homestead properties throughout the region using manufactured accidents and legal technicalities. He knew. She whispered, her voice filled with horror and growing understanding. Thomas knew they were planning to kill him. But he also discovered something much bigger. The correspondence revealed a conspiracy that reached far beyond Cinder Bluff. Territorial officials were coordinating with local strongmen like Copper Jim to systematically eliminate small farmers and consolidate their holdings under the control of politically connected syndicates. The mining accidents were just one method. Others included water rights manipulation, fraudulent debt collection, and outright intimidation by hired gunmen. Thomas Morrison had stumbled onto this network while researching legal precedents for challenging his debt obligations. His correspondence with a territorial judge's clerk had uncovered the paper trail linking dozens of convenient deaths to property transfers, all following the same pattern of manufactured evidence and rushed legal proceedings. They murdered them both. Dasan said, his voice flat with controlled fury that made the air around them seem to crackle with dangerous energy. Your husband and my sister. She must have learned about the conspiracy through him, and when she started asking questions, they silenced her to protect themselves. Evangeline finished understanding, flooding through her like ice water. But Thomas hid this evidence, knowing that someday someone would need proof. Thunder crashed overhead, and rain continued falling in torrents that turned the canyon into a temporary river, rushing toward the desert floor below. But now, their immediate pursuers seemed like a secondary concern. They carried evidence that could expose corruption reaching into the highest levels of territorial government if they survived long enough to present it to honest authorities who still existed somewhere in the system. The sound of approaching voices grew louder, despite the storm's fury. Through the curtain of rain, they could see lantern light bobbing among the rocks as the search party closed in from multiple directions. There was nowhere left to run, and with Evangeline's injured ankle, they could not outpace mounted men across open terrain. We have to reach the mine, Dasan said, the decision crystallizing in his mind as he studied their limited options. If Copper Jim is using it as his base of operations, that's where we'll find the evidence we need to corroborate what Thomas discovered. That's also where we'll find Copper Jim and his men waiting for us. Yes, he agreed grimly. But running away won't save us. They'll hunt us down eventually, and then this evidence dies with us. At least at the mine, we might have a chance to expose the truth before we're killed. It was the kind of desperate strategy that Apache warriors had employed against impossible odds for generations. Attack where the enemy least expected it, use their confidence against them, and die fighting rather than be slowly hunted down like wounded animals. As they picked their way down the treacherous canyon wall through the driving rain, with lantern light growing brighter behind them, Evangeline found herself changing in ways she could never have imagined when her husband was alive. Fear was still present, but it no longer paralyzed her. Instead, it sharpened her senses and focused her determination with steely focus. "Teach me to shoot properly," she said as they reached the canyon floor where a narrow stream rushed toward the desert with storm runoff. "If we're going to die at that mine, I want to take some of them with me." Dasan looked at her with something approaching admiration. The frightened woman who had cowered in the cabin was gone, replaced by someone harder and infinitely more dangerous. "Can you kill a man if necessary?" "I already have," she replied, thinking of Deputy Rattler and the satisfying sound her shovel had made against his skull. The question is whether I can kill enough of them to matter. My grandfather taught me that it is not the number of enemies defeated that measures a warrior's worth, Dasan said as they moved through the rushing water. It is the courage shown in the face of impossible odds. You have already proven your courage, Evangeline Morrison. Now we discover your capacity for warfare. The horses they appropriated were a pair of sturdy cow ponies discovered at a line shack on the periphery of Copper Jim's vast holdings, animals bred for endurance rather than speed, capable of covering rough country that would founder more delicate mounts. Dasan led them through a network of dry washes that would conceal their tracks until the rain stopped, while Evangeline rode in determined silence, despite the throbbing pain in her injured ankle. They approached the Raven Rock mine complex as the storm began to dissipate shafts of afternoon sunlight, slanting through breaking clouds to paint the industrial landscape in shades of gold and amber. The operation was larger than either had expected, multiple shaft entrances, processing equipment, and a small company town that housed workers and their families. Too many people, Evangeline observed, studying the layout from their concealment among the tailings piles. If shooting starts, innocents will be caught in the crossfire. Copper Jim would consider that an advantage, Dasan replied grimly. He's the type to use human shields when cornered. Weak men often hide behind the innocent when their crimes catch up to them. They worked their way closer under cover of the industrial noise, studying guard positions and trying to identify which buildings might house the evidence they sought. The main office seemed most likely, but it was also the most heavily defended, with armed men positioned at every approach. That was when Dr. Hale appeared, seemingly from nowhere, moving with the careful stealth of a man who had learned to be invisible when necessary. His medical bag provided perfect cover for approaching the mine complex, and his familiar face ensured that guards wouldn't question his presence among the workers and their families. "I've been looking for you," he said quietly when he reached their hiding place, his voice heavy with exhaustion and something deeper, the weight of decisions that could not be undone. "There's something you need to know before you go any further." His face was haggard with exhaustion and guilt, the features of a man who had been wrestling with his conscience and losing badly. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession and desperate hope for redemption. "I helped them kill your husband," he told Evangeline directly, unable to meet her eyes. "Copper Jim threatened my family, and I was too much of a coward to resist. I falsified medical records, provided cover for murder, signed death certificates I knew were lies." The words hung in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Evangeline's hand moved instinctively to the rifle she now carried with growing confidence. But something in the doctor's manner, his obvious anguish, his presence here despite the danger, stayed her finger on the trigger. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Because I can't live with what I've done, and because you need to know that this conspiracy goes deeper than you realize." Hale pulled a leather portfolio from his medical bag, his hands shaking as he opened it. "Copper Jim isn't the real power here. He takes orders from territorial officials who take orders from mining syndicates back east. The whole system is rotten from bottom to top." The documents he showed them were devastating correspondence between territorial officials and corporate representatives, maps showing planned consolidation of properties, financial records detailing payments to local strongmen like Copper Jim for services rendered. It was the missing piece that completed the picture Thomas Morrison had begun assembling before his death. "Federal marshals are already investigating in Tucson." Hale continued, his voice growing stronger as he committed himself fully to the path of redemption. "If we can get this evidence to them along with what you've already gathered, it might be enough to bring down the entire network." "What about your family?" Dasan asked, recognizing the sacrifice the doctor was prepared to make. I've sent them east to my brother's farm in Missouri. They'll be safe there while I try to atone for my cowardice. Hale's voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if the decision to finally act had lifted a tremendous weight from his shoulders. My wife. She doesn't know what I've done, but she knows something was wrong. When I told her we needed to leave immediately, she didn't ask questions. Just packed the children and left on the morning stage. You could have gone with them, Evangeline said, studying the man who had contributed to her husband's death, but now risked everything to expose the truth. No, Hale replied firmly. I couldn't. A man who runs from his sins carries them with him wherever he goes. I need to face what I've done to make it right, if that's still possible. There's a federal telegraph station in Tombstone, he continued. If we can reach it with this evidence, we'll never make it past Copper Jim's men, Evangeline said practically. They'll be watching every road out of the territory. Then we don't run. Dasan said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a warrior who had chosen his ground for the final battle. We end this here tonight before they can destroy the evidence or eliminate more witnesses. The plan that formed between them was simple in concept, but desperate in execution. Hale would return to the mine complex as if making routine medical calls, carrying concealed weapons, and positioning himself to cut off Copper Jim's escape routes. Dasan and Evangeline would create a diversion at the main shaft, drawing guards away from the office building where the most damaging evidence was likely stored. Before they separated, Dasan reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small object carved from white stone, a bear claw wrapped with sinew and decorated with a single eagle feather. This belonged to my father's father, he told Evangeline, pressing it into her palm. He carried it through 20 years of warfare and died peacefully in his sleep at 90 winters. It has protected 3 generations of warriors. She looked down at the medicine pouch, feeling the smooth stone warm under her touch. I can't take this. It's too precious. You can and you will, he replied firmly. Tonight, we face enemies who would destroy everything good in this world for profit and power. You will need all the protection available, both earthly and spiritual. Evangeline fastened the medicine pouch around her neck, feeling its weight settle against her heart. What if we don't survive this? Then we die knowing we stood against evil when good people were needed, Dasan replied. My sister would understand. Your husband would be proud. That is enough. She reached out and took his hand, their fingers intertwining in the gathering dusk. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. For giving me a chance to fight back instead of just running away. Thank you, he replied, for reminding me that some things are worth fighting for even when the odds are impossible. They held that moment between them, two people who had found in each other the courage to face whatever darkness lay ahead. Then they separated to their positions, each carrying hope that the other would live to see another dawn. It was the kind of strategy that required equal measures of skill, luck, and divine intervention. But as they made their final preparations in the gathering dusk, all 3 understood that they had moved beyond the point where retreat remained possible. Too many people had died for this conspiracy to continue, and too much evil had flourished in the shadows of territorial corruption. The final confrontation that would determine the fate of Cinder Bluff and possibly the entire territory was about to begin. The mine's main shaft descended into the earth's bowels, like the throat of some primordial beast, surrounded by towering piles of ore tailings and the skeletal framework of processing equipment that had not operated at full capacity in months. As darkness fell across the desert, lanterns began appearing throughout the complex, turning the industrial landscape into a constellation of flickering stars that cast dancing shadows on the surrounding rocks. Dasan and Evangeline approached through a maze of abandoned mining equipment, their movements masked by the constant noise of steam engines and crushing machinery. She had insisted on carrying Thomas's rifle, despite her injured ankle, and her determination to see this through had impressed even the Apache warrior, who had learned to respect courage wherever he found it. "Remember," he whispered as they reached their final position overlooking the main shaft. "Create chaos, then disappear. Don't try to be a hero. Heroes die young in this country, and dead heroes help no one. I stopped trying to be anything other than a survivor the moment they murdered Thomas," she replied, checking her ammunition supply with the methodical care he had taught her. "But survivors sometimes have to fight for the right to keep surviving." Dr. Hale had already infiltrated the complex, his medical bag providing perfect cover for his presence among the miners and their families. His signal, a lantern placed in a specific window of the main office building, would indicate when he had located the primary cache of incriminating documents and was ready for the diversion to begin. The signal came at midnight, a flickering light that appeared and disappeared in the space of heartbeats. Dasan rose from concealment like a ghost, given substance, his rifle speaking in measured cadence, as he picked off sentries with the precision that had made Apache warriors legendary throughout the territory. Evangeline followed his example, her shots less accurate, but effective enough to create the confusion they desperately needed. Guards ran toward the sound of gunfire, their shouts echoing off the canyon walls as they tried to coordinate a response to an attack they couldn't see or understand. In the chaos, Hale slipped into the main office building, where territorial corruption had been documented in meticulous detail by men who never expected their crimes to be exposed to public scrutiny. But Copper Jim was no fool, and he had not survived this long in a dangerous business without developing keen instincts for treachery and ambush. Instead of rushing toward the sound of gunfire like his men, he moved in the opposite direction, seeking the source of the attack with the patience of a predator who understood that the real threat lay in shadows rather than obvious displays of force. He found them as they were preparing to withdraw from their initial position, his massive form appearing between them and their planned escape route, like a mountain of malevolent flesh. The nickel-plated Colt in his hand reflected lantern light as he smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had finally cornered his most elusive prey. "Well, well," he rumbled, his voice carrying easily over the industrial noise. The Apache warrior and his tame widow come calling like social visitors. "How thoughtful of you to save me the trouble of hunting you down across half the territory." Dasan's rifle swung toward the threat, but Copper Jim had positioned himself carefully, using a steam engine's bulk as cover while maintaining clear lines of fire. More importantly, he had something they hadn't expected. Dr. Hale held at gunpoint by one of his trusted lieutenants, the medical bag containing crucial evidence lying on the ground between them, like a prize awaiting collection. "Seems your friend here got careless." Copper Jim continued, his smile widening to reveal teeth stained with tobacco juice. "Thought he could play hero and make up for his previous cooperation." Noble sentiment, but poor timing. Real poor timing. "Let him go." Evangeline said, her rifle trained on Copper Jim despite the impossible odds they faced. "Your fight is with us, not with him. My fight, little lady, is with anyone who threatens my business interests." Copper Jim replied, his voice taking on the tone of a man lecturing children about adult responsibilities. "And right now, that includes all you troublemakers who can't seem to understand how things work in this territory. See, I got investments to protect, partnerships to maintain, and a reputation for efficiency that brings me contracts from very important people." The standoff stretched like a held breath. 4 people with weapons pointed at each other while the mine's operations continued around them with pitiless regularity. In the distance, guards were still responding to the diversion. their confusion buying precious seconds for a resolution that seemed increasingly unlikely to favor the forces of justice. "You know what your problem is," Apache Copper Jim continued conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than preparing for mutual slaughter. "You think this is about good and evil, right and wrong. But it ain't. It's about money and power and the simple fact that some folks got more of both than others. My grandfather would have called you a man who mistakes weakness for strength." Dasan replied, his rifle never wavering from its target. "You hide behind hired guns and corrupt officials because you lack the courage to face consequences for your actions." "Consequences." Copper Jim laughed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. "Boy, I am the consequences in this territory. I decide who lives, who dies, who prospers, and who disappears in the desert for the buzzards to clean up." That was when the earth itself intervened in their dispute. The storm's runoff had been accumulating in underground chambers for hours, building pressure against rock formations weakened by years of intensive mining operations. With a rumble that started deep in the Earth's core and built to a crescendo that drowned out all other sound, the main shaft began to collapse. Water erupted from fissures in the canyon walls, turning the mine complex into a maze of flash floods and falling debris within minutes. Steam engines shrieked as their boilers were doused with muddy water, and the careful organization of the industrial facility dissolved into chaos as men ran for their lives. In that chaos, Dasan moved with the fluid grace that had made his people masters of warfare in impossible terrain. He rolled sideways as Copper Jim's first shot blasted the space where he had been standing, came up running, and closed the distance between them with the speed of a striking rattlesnake. But Copper Jim was no soft territorial official who had never faced physical danger. He was a frontier fighter who had survived countless battles through superior strength and absolute ruthlessness. When Dasan's rifle stock swung toward his head, he caught it with one massive hand and yanked the Apache warrior off balance with enough force to dislocate a normal man's shoulder. They went down together in a tangle of thrashing limbs, rolling through mud and debris as the mine continued its violent self-destruction around them. Copper Jim's superior weight and reach gave him significant advantages, but Dasan had learned to fight from masters who understood that victory belonged to the swift and clever rather than the merely strong. While the two men struggled in the mud like primitive beasts, Evangeline found herself facing the lieutenant who had been holding Dr. Hale prisoner. The man's attention was divided between the collapsing mine and the fight between his boss and the Apache, giving her the opportunity she had been waiting for since this nightmare began weeks ago. Her first shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his weapon with a cry of pain and surprise. Her second shot, aimed with the careful precision Dasan had taught her during their desert journey, ended his threat permanently. It was the first time she had deliberately killed another human being, and she discovered that she felt no remorse, only grim satisfaction that one more instrument of corruption had been removed from the world. Dr. Hale retrieved his medical bag and its precious contents, but their troubles were far from over. More guards were converging on their position, and the rising water was cutting off possible escape routes with each passing minute. They were trapped in a collapsing mine with enemies closing in from all sides and death rushing toward them in the form of floodwaters and falling stone. The fight between Dasan and Copper Jim had moved to a narrow ore platform suspended over the main shaft, where rushing water created a thunderous din that made communication impossible. Both men were bloodied and exhausted, but neither was willing to yield ground in what they both understood was a fight to the death that would determine the fate of everyone they cared about. Copper Jim's size and strength were telling in the confined space, but Dasan's speed and training in unarmed combat kept him alive through exchanges that would have killed a lesser fighter. When Copper Jim's massive fist connected with his ribs, he felt bones crack with audible snaps, but he used the momentum to drive his knee into his opponent's midsection, with enough force to double the big man over. Should have minded your own business, Apache. Copper Jim gasped as they grappled on the swaying platform. Should have stayed in the desert where you belong instead of meddling in white man's affairs. This became my business when you murdered my sister. Dasan replied through gritted teeth, his hands seeking a grip on his opponent's throat. A pony was worth more than all your gold and land combined. That was when Evangeline arrived at the platform's edge, her rifle at the ready but unable to fire for fear of hitting Dasan in the confused melee. Instead, she did something that surprised everyone present, including herself. She began systematically destroying the platform's support cables with precise shots that sent sparks flying in all directions. "What are you doing?" Hale shouted over the noise of rushing water and collapsing timber. "Ending this," she replied, her voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who had moved beyond fear into a realm where only results mattered. "If we can't separate them, we finish this together." The platform began to sway as its supports failed one by one. Copper Jim, realizing his danger, tried to disengage from his fight with Dasan and reach solid ground, but the Apache warrior had no intention of allowing his sister's killer to escape justice again. "You want to know about consequences?" Dasan shouted over the roar of falling water and breaking timber. "Let me show you what they look like." With a cry that echoed the war songs of his ancestors, men who had faced cavalry charges and artillery bombardments, with nothing but courage and determination, Dasan wrapped his arms around Copper Jim's massive torso and drove both of them toward the edge of the disintegrating platform. They fell together into the rushing water below, where the mine's collapse had created a temporary underground river that swept everything before it toward unknown destinations in the desert darkness. Evangeline watched from above as the two figures disappeared into the flood, carried away by forces beyond human control or intervention. The silence that followed their disappearance seemed almost supernatural, after the chaos and violence broken only by the sound of settling debris and running water that gradually found new channels through the devastated mine complex. "Is it over?" Hale asked, clutching his medical bag with evidence that could bring down an entire conspiracy. "For them, maybe," Evangeline replied, studying the devastation around them while water continued to rise around their ankles. "But there's still work to be done if we want to get out of here alive." They made their way through the flooded mine complex as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, searching for survivors and trying to assess the full extent of the damage. Many of the miners and their families had escaped to higher ground when the collapse began. But the industrial facility itself was a total loss that would never operate again. Sheriff Malloy arrived with the sunrise, leading a small army of deputies and hired guns who had expected to find easy prey trapped in the ruins. Instead, they discovered a woman and a doctor waiting calmly beside a pile of documents that would destroy careers and topple governments if they ever reached honest authorities. "Well, well," Malloy said, his familiar smile cold as winter starlight and twice as sharp. "Seems like you folks have been having quite an eventful evening. Hope you enjoyed yourselves, because it's going to be your last night on Earth." His confidence was unshaken by the mine's destruction or Copper Jim's apparent death. Men like Malloy had contingency plans for every situation, and he had not reached his current position without learning how to adapt when circumstances changed unexpectedly. "Drop your weapons and surrender quietly." He continued, his deputies spreading out to cover all possible escape routes with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this many times before. "I promise you'll receive fair trials before your executions. Territorial law requires certain formalities, even for obvious criminals like yourselves." That was when the sound of approaching horses echoed across the desert morning, accompanied by the jingle of military equipment and the authoritative voices of men accustomed to being obeyed without question. Federal marshals had finally arrived, responding to telegrams and reports that had been flooding territorial offices for days. Marshal William Hayes was a weathered veteran in his middle 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much corruption to be surprised by human depravity. He rode at the head of a column of armed deputies carrying federal warrants and the authority to arrest anyone involved in territorial crimes regardless of their local connections or political influence. Sheriff Malloy. Hayes called out, his voice carrying clearly across the devastated mine complex. You and your men will drop your weapons immediately and submit to federal custody. Any resistance will be met with appropriate force. The standoff that followed lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours to the people caught between competing authorities. Malloy's hired guns looked uncertainly between their employer and the federal officers, trying to calculate odds and consequences while precious seconds ticked away toward violence or surrender. Hale made the decision for everyone by walking calmly toward the federal marshals, his medical bag held prominently in front of him, where everyone could see it. Marshal Hayes. He called out, his voice steady, despite the exhaustion that lined his face. I have evidence of territorial corruption involving murder, land fraud, and conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of government. Evidence that will interest federal prosecutors very much. That broke the stalemate like a stone through glass. Malloy's men began surrendering rather than face federal charges for obstructing justice, and within minutes, the corrupt sheriff found himself in custody along with his remaining deputies. The reign of terror that had plagued Cinder Bluff and the surrounding territory was finally coming to an end. But Evangeline barely noticed the arrests and official proceedings. Her attention was focused on the mine's flooded main shaft, where rushing water had carried away the Apache warrior who had become so much more than her protector during their brief but intense time together. 3 days later, she was sitting beside Willow Creek in the shade of the cottonwoods when she heard footsteps approaching through the tall grass. She looked up to see a familiar figure walking slowly toward her, battered and bloody, but very much alive. Dasan had survived his fall into the underground river, had been swept miles downstream before managing to reach safety, and had spent days walking back through desert terrain that would have killed most men. "You're alive," she said, rising to meet him with tears streaming down her face and joy flooding through her like sunrise after the longest night. "So are you," he replied, pulling her into an embrace that spoke of shared survival. Mutual respect and emotions deeper than either was quite ready to put into words. They held each other beside the creek, while federal marshals finished their investigations and territorial officials began the long process of unwinding years of systematic corruption. Copper Jim's body was never found, presumably swept away by the floodwaters to disappear forever in the vast desert that had claimed so many other victims over the years. The evidence they had gathered proved devastating to the conspiracy. Dozens of officials were arrested, mining syndicates were disbanded, and fraudulent land seizures were reversed throughout the territory. Dr. Hale's testimony provided crucial details about the medical aspects of the murders, while the documents recovered from the mine complex revealed the full scope of the corruption network that had been bleeding the territory dry. Evangeline's homestead was restored to her ownership free and clear of all debts, while Dasan was offered permanent employment as a federal scout and interpreter. More importantly, they were both offered a chance to build new lives in a territory where justice might finally have a chance to flourish over naked greed and violence. 6 months later, they were married in a ceremony that thoughtfully blended traditions from both cultures, with Dr. Hale performing the civil service required by territorial law, and an Apache medicine man blessing their union according to ancient customs that predated any government authority. The wedding celebration was held at the restored cabin with tables arranged in the shade of cottonwoods, and the entire town invited to share in their happiness. Dasan built a traditional smokehouse beside the spring and taught local farmers to read weather signs that would improve irrigation throughout the valley. Evangeline established a school specifically designed for children from mixed families, creating educational opportunities that honored both Apache and white traditions, while preparing students for the rapidly changing world that surrounded them. The desert wind still swept through Cinder Bluff with predictable regularity, carrying dust and dreams across the vast landscape in equal measure. But now it carried additional cargo. The laughter of children learning to read in 2 languages and the sound of honest work being accomplished without fear of corrupt interference. And the quiet conversations of people who had discovered that courage and compassion could transform even the harshest environment into something genuinely beautiful. On peaceful evenings, they would sit together on the cabin's rebuilt porch and watch the sun set over the desert that both had learned to call home. The land that had once seemed impossibly harsh and unforgiving now revealed its subtle beauties, morning light transforming distant mountains into cathedral spires, resilient plants that bloomed magnificently in the most challenging conditions, and the vast sky that reminded them daily of endless possibilities stretching toward every horizon. Apache's carefully crafted beads hung in a place of honor above their fireplace, serving as a permanent reminder of the sister whose death had brought them together and whose spirit continued guiding their steps along difficult paths. Justice had indeed arrived in its own time, as she had promised in her final message, bringing not merely punishment for the guilty, but healing and hope for those who had survived, and to build something better from the ashes of tragedy. In the end, that proved to be Apache's true legacy, not simply the justice that had finally avenged her murder, but the love that had grown from tragedy's ashes, demonstrating conclusively that even in the most unforgiving country, imaginable life would always find ways to flourish and create meaning from suffering. The butterfly's brief flight had touched 2 hearts and changed a territory forever.